Hey, welcome. We're going to talk about the American Revolution today. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. If I had theme music, this is where it would start, right? So American Revolution, basically, the purpose of any colony is to make money for the parent country. And we've already talked about that. But that's mercantilism. This is that ideas that start to come about during the Enlightenment and the age of exploration. And the American colonies are really no different, except for the fact that the American colonies are different in a way that they don't cost England any money, right? Like, so the English aren't getting gold and silver like the Spanish. They're not necessarily grabbing a ton of fur like the French, but they're not really costing the English government any money, like any money to maintain them. And so they have yeah, they're growing tobacco and sugar and all of that stuff, and so they're making some money out of there. And there's a little bit of trade, and that's really the focus of England. And England is trying to keep their hands away from over regulating the colonies during this time frame because they don't cost them money. They don't have to have troops stationed in America, and they might float some boats in there every now and then, like Navy or whatever, but like it's not really expensive. And so in 1651, you see the passage of something called the Navigation Acts, which just basically says English ships are the only ones that can carry goods between England and the colonies, and it kind of lays out some laws about items that can only be shipped to England to prevent the American colonists from shipping their sugar abroad or going somewhere else. The most valuable products that are going to come out of America during this time are sugar, tobacco, indigo, rice, molasses, and turpentine. And so, like, England wants to hold on to those and make money off of them. But if the Americans slip a little bit of sugar out of the colonies, hey, no big deal, because overall, England's making lots of money on them. And so these laws are on the books, but they're not strictly enforced. And this is something we call salutary neglect. It's just basically looking the other way, like, hey, these laws are on the books, but we're not going to really pay attention because you know what? Everything's going pretty well. And so there's no enforcement of these issues. And the colonists kind of start to become accustomed to not being regulated. And that's all going to come to a change in 1754 when the Americans run into problems as they start to expand the colonies over the Appalachian Mountains and into places that are claimed by the French. And so the French have some settlers in there. They've been trading with the Native Americans for a while. The Americans roll into places like Kentucky or Tennessee, modern day Kentucky or Tennessee. And they start to fight over settlement and land and those types of things. And basically war breaks out, or Pennsylvania, even like Western Pennsylvania, not even all the way over the Appalachian Mountains. And some conflicts break out between settlers and the French and settlers and the Native Americans. And the British are called to kind of squash that. And so we break into what we refer to as the French and Indian War in the United States. The French and Indian War is a subsection of a much larger war that's fought between the British and the French, which is called the 7 Years' War, which takes place in Europe. It also takes place in India and in Asia, and any place the French and the British have colonies that are close together. And so the British actually do something a little bit different. They fight the French on the continent of Europe, but they hire mercenaries from Prussia, not Russia. Think of Prussia, modern day Germany, Prussia, to fight. And so they pay them, they send their troops to America, they send them to India and those types of things. And so this war is really expensive for the British. And while the British ultimately win with the help of the American colonists, there's lots of problems that come about from this. Well, the first one is going to be in America, and that's the one that we're going to focus on. The problems in America is that the Americans win this conflict, and oh geez, Louise. Okay, the Americans win this conflict, and they expect to be able to move west of the Appalachian Mountains and settle in this new region that they just fought for. But there's Native Americans that live there, and they don't want these colonists in their backyards, right? And so the British had now like been trying to create friendly relationships with the with the natives, and they end up in this situation where they no longer have to compete for the affections of the natives. They just want to keep peace, right? And so one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to create this proclamation line, which runs through here on our like we control this area. Canada used to control this area over here on the left, this in the orange mustardy color, right? And now after the war, England controls all the lands east of the Mississippi. And the Americans want to move in, and the American colonists want to move in here. Well, the British create this proclamation line to prevent them. And that's the first step towards the American Revolution. The American colonists are very upset about the fact that they're being limited on their expansion, their westward expansion, right? And ultimately, the British conclude a couple things after this war, that the colonists are unable to respond to the military threat of the French and the Native Americans, and the British military needed to step in. The second one is the military effort in the colonies were very expensive, and the colonists should probably have to help pay for that. And the third one is the British troops need to be kept in North America on a permanent basis for two reasons. One is to protect the colonists from the Native Americans, and two is England needs a standing army now to protect the worldwide colonies. Egypt, they're not Egypt yet, India, maybe Australia, maybe places in Asia, as well as North America. And if we go back in time and we look at some of those constitutionalism in England videos, we realize, and we take ideas of the Enlightenment, and we start to realize that a standing army in the eyes of the British people is a tool of a tyrant. And so in England, the people of England are not going to tolerate the king or parliament having a large-scale military force on the island of Britain. But if that force is in the colonies, well, then who cares? Because that's not Britain. That's not us. That's all the way over there. And so we're going to keep a large-scale army in the colonies, and it's going to upset the American colonists because they, like their British counterparts, see themselves as British and hold those values that, hey, this large army is a tool of a tyrant, and they're there to control us, and that's problematic. Okay, there's problems with the Native Americans in the West Lands of the Appalachians, and England tries to solve this problem by creating that proclamation line, which we talked about, right? Problem number two, this war costs tons of money, and so now all of a sudden the Americans are going to be asked to pay taxes on this conflict for themselves, and they haven't had to pay their way before. And so this national debt of England doubles during the war. The new lands are going to cost England even more money to maintain, and they want to find ways to pay off the debt. And so everyone under the British Crown is expected to help in this effort. And American colonies have really paid very little in the ways of taxes. And now that's going to change, right? So to pay off this debt, we create new taxes. The nobility in England doesn't want to pay taxes, and so they argue, they kind of finagle ways, because rich people don't like to pay taxes. They finagle ways to push that tax burden on the common people. And the common people start to complain because, hey, you look at those colonists over there in America, they're not paying their fair share. And so England starts to do things to try to make the American colonists pay their fair share of taxes, right? 1764, they passed something called the Currency Act, which says that, hey, you know what? The colonies can no longer pay for goods in paper money that's printed in the colonies. They need to pay for things in gold and silver and send precious metals and bullion back to the British, the British Kingdom, because that's going to increase the wealth of England, and England's going to be able to pay off their war debts with this. The problem is there's no gold mines, there's no silver mines in the American colonies. There's not a ton of what we're going to refer to as hard money, gold and silver, in the American colonies during this time frame, right? And so this act starts to shrink the American economy, which is already not all that great. It's already cash-strapped to begin with. All right, number two, 1764, we passed something called the Sugar Act, which actually reduces the price of sugar. And you would think, hey, that's a good thing. I like sugar. I don't like to pay money for it. However, in New England, which was originally founded by Puritans and under this idea of religious purity, a secondary income, or like really probably the largest economic booster of New England during this time, is smuggling sugar and molasses from the French West Indies, the French Caribbean, into New England, turning it into rum and selling it. And so now England's trying to get money off of that. They're making sure that the New England's not smuggling in goods, and if they're going to buy sugar from the French West Indies or from the French Caribbean, that sugar needs to come through Britain, and that's going to raise the price of sugar for those smugglers. So people like John Hancock, Samuel Adams aren't going to do that. They're going to continue to smuggle goods in. And so these navigation acts that were originally put in place in the 1750s that were kind of forgotten about or not enforced, all of a sudden become much more enforced. and the British custom agents start to search ships that come into port, and the Sugar Act creates this new level of court systems. It's called the Vice Admiralty Court, in which the King of England places a judge or a magistrate in charge of like smuggling offenses, where before these smuggling offenses were tried by a jury of their peers in New England, and oftentimes smugglers were let go because, hey, you know, they're friends and they're the ones that make the rum, and everybody likes people that make rum, right? And so now all of a sudden this judge is an agent of the king, and he's not going to be as lenient. And so in the enforcement of the Navigation Act and the enforcement of smuggling crimes are going to increase during 1764. And the colonists argued that this is a violation of their rights, of the Petition of Rights and the English Bill of Rights, which guarantee things like trial by jury of a peer, right? And so the colonists argue that this goes against the English Bill of Rights, and it takes away their rights as British subjects. They see them as British. They're not Americans yet. They see themselves as British, and they should have the same rights as the British subjects. The colonists argue that, hey, if you start taking away our rights, basically we're slaves, which is interesting because they also argue for the existence of slavery in the colonies. So like, if it's so bad being a slave, why do you hold slaves? Something to think about, right? The Americans see themselves as British, and this is an indirect tax, and the law of the Sugar Act lessens their footing on equality with the people of Britain. All right, indirect tax means that it's a tax put on a product that gets passed along to the consumer. A direct tax is a tax that the consumer specifically pays. When you buy gas, you're paying an indirect tax that's tied into that thing. If you buy it from Exxon or BP or whoever, they've already been charged by the government X amount of dollars per gallon or liter or whatever of gasoline they make, and that is just tied into the price. When you get a paycheck, your payroll taxes are taken out, and that is a direct tax that is paid by you to the government. So there's two different ideas, direct tax and indirect tax. The Stamp Act of 1765 comes around, and this is a direct tax. The colonies have never had a direct tax placed on them before, and this is paid directly to the crown from the colonists. And it's imposed on things like newspapers and legal documents and playing cards and dice and all of this stuff. And the colonists are upset. England thought, hey, this is going to be a tax on the people that are most likely to pay it, like doctors and lawyers and printers and those types of people. And they're going to be able to pay this tax no problem. And maybe they pass it along to the simple civilians, or maybe they don't. But the Americans react to it very violently because they don't have representation in Parliament. And so now we start to get this argument about no taxation without representation. However, the colonists really don't want representation because they would be outvoted by the people by the rest of the representatives in Parliament, right? And so this is problematic for the colonists, and once again, it starts to make themselves seem unequal to the regular British subjects. Even though regular British subjects might have to pay direct tax, they do have representation, and that is something the colonists don't have during this time. Right? It's a big shift in taxation from before the French and Indian War, where colonists typically would pay indirect taxes on items, but never pay directly to the king, or they would pay taxes to their local government, which would pass the money on, but never was the tax directly paid to the crown before the Stamp Act. And so we can see examples of the Stamp Act there, or on this paper. Or on impression on a legal document. Okay, 1765, the British, who now have a large standing army in the colonies, passed something called the Quartering Act of 1765, in which it requires the colonists to provide barracks for the British troops that are in America. And the colonists are beside themselves because in the Petition of Rights, they're guaranteed that they don't have to quarter soldiers during times of peace, right? And so the colonists have to build and feed, build housing and feed these British troops. And if they don't have enough housing, then the British troops can live in unoccupied buildings. And this is, again, this is an idea that's gonna run contrary to the ideas of John Locke, and the fact that it's going to be taking somebody's property, and it's going to be a violation of the English Bill of Rights. okay, the colonies are required to pay for troops and the cost of living, and it's problematic. And so since the time of James II, the standing army had troubled the British. The British had rubbed the British the wrong way. It troubles them because the standing army is a tool of a tyrant, and this army can force the colonists to do things that they maybe don't necessarily want to do. Okay, and so in 1765, Massachusetts calls other colonies to meet in New York and discuss how to respond to the Stamp Act, and it's called the Stamp Act Congress. And this is the second time that the colonies have gotten together as one. During the French and Indian War, we have a thing called the Albany Congress, where we gather and the colonies try to unify some type of common defense, but it's ruled that all the colonists see themselves differently, and so there's no agreement, and so there's a difference between all 13 colonies. Don't think of them as America. Think of them as New England and New Jersey and Vermont or not Vermont. I'm sorry, Virginia and South Carolina. These are all individual quote unquote countries or individual states. All right. Well, when we get together in the Stamp Act, they start to look at each other and like, hey, you know what? We're all going to start to we're all affected by these laws in similar ways, and so now they all want to protect their liberties as loyal subjects to the crown, but they see themselves kind of in the same boat. Before, there's 13 individual boats floating in the sea, and now there's going to be 13 dudes sitting in the same vessel that are dealing with the same things, right? And so they outline these unconstitutional taxation without this idea of unconstitutional taxation without representation and without trials by jury, and they send them to the crown. And England just basically rejects all of these problems. And they're like, look, we're the mother country. We know what's best for you. Do what we say, right? And so England believes that the colonists ultimately need the protection of England more than England needs the colonies. And this is what's going to spur probably some of the English motivation that's going to lead to the American Revolution, which probably honestly could have been avoided early on. But they look at the New England colonies that were established for religion, and they see them differently from the middle colonies, which focus on trade, and the southern colonies, which focus on cash crops. And the King of England is going to look at these guys, and he's going to make the errant observation that they don't have a lot in common. Okay, in Massachusetts, we rally around the Stamp Act. Taxation without representation is tyranny. In Virginia, Patrick Henry introduces this thing, the Virginia Stamp Act resolution, which again calls for no taxation without representation. And this is important because you see Massachusetts, which is a New England colony, agreeing with Virginia, which is a southern colony. And these guys couldn't be any further apart when they originally get to America. But by 1765, they're starting to agree on things. And by 1776, they're going to be in unison. Okay, and while the upper class is going to work for things like the Stamp Act Congress, the lower classes, the common people, are going to get involved in the struggle as well. A group called the Sons of Liberty is going to get started in Boston, and these are going to be shopkeepers and merchants and artisans. And when we say artisans, don't think of like painters on the street, like artists. These are going to be like blacksmiths and print setters and brewers, and these people that have some sort of it's a trade or a skill that is taught. And so these are like middle class dudes, and they protest the act, and they burn the effigy of one of the stamp agents in Boston, and they throw rocks at his house, and then he resigns the next day, because why do you want to live when places where people are lighting paper mache pinatas of you on fire? I mean, what's the next step? They're going to light you on fire, and they throw rocks at your house, and you don't like that. And they go to the governor, lieutenant governor of Massachusetts' home, and Thomas Hutchinson, and they denounce the Stamp Act, and they ask him to, and he doesn't, and they light his house on fire. And so this is a violent crowd that's rolling around during this time frame. And then in addition, you have the Daughters of Liberty, which is a group of females that band together to protest English overreach in the same things like the Stamp Act, Quartering Act, or whatever. And they start a boycott of British goods. And this is when America starts to transition from tea drinkers to coffee drinkers. They boycott tea. They boycott linens that are made in England. They boycott, I don't know, anything that comes from England, they stop buying. So if you're a merchant in the American colonies and you get caught selling British goods, You got to answer not only to the women of the colonies, but also the Sons of Liberty that will come around and rough up your shop. Then the merchants in England start losing money, and they start to put pressure on their legislative bodies to bring about changes so they can sell things to the colonies again, right? And so women don't even have the vote. They don't have political process, but they're able to bring about change through this protest, right? Chapters of sons and daughters that would grow in every colony. You'd start in New England, you end all the way down in Georgia. Men would react violently against those people that bought things in England, and the rich support the ideas, but they don't necessarily support the violence. And ultimately, the British merchants are the ones that bring about the change. Women in the colonies started, the British merchants in the colonies reject this idea. They want to make money. They don't care about the political rights of the people in the colonies. They want to make money off of them. And in March 1767, the pressure of the boycott and the British merchants in England causes Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. And the colonists have a huge victory on their hands. They celebrate. John Hancock, who is one of the richest smugglers in all of New England, buys everybody in Boston a drink at the pub. If you show up, John Hancock's paying, right? It's a big celebration. It's a big win for everybody. And we're going to stop video one right there. We're going to come back and see what happens on the second half in just a minute. Thanks for tuning in.